Hey guys, this is EckhartsLadder. Hello and welcome to another Star Wars Legends lore video. Today's content is a little bit different than the stuff that's normally on my channel. First of all, it will be audio only. Unfortunately, this is the necessity due to some personal time constraints that I've got going on. So if you want to skip today, don't worry, I'll be back tomorrow with some ordinary content. I'll also be rambling today, and to me, this is sort of a practice for an eventual podcast that I want to get going, but I'll talk about that towards the end of the video. One of the most common questions I get, and probably my favorite actually, is where should I start if I want to get into Star Wars Legends? The old expanded universe is rather intimidating between the books, the comics, the video games, the trading card games, the tabletop RPGs, and everything else. There's over 40 years of material to sift through. If you're wondering, well, why would I even try? It's not like any of this stuff will be canon anymore. There are a couple of answers to that. First of all, just because something isn't canon doesn't mean that doesn't continue to influence the story. For example, early Star Wars Legends books defined how certain pieces of technology work. That, along with the names of planets and alien species, is generally considered to be the same, even moving forward into canon, unless it's been explicitly overwritten, and that's according to Leland Shee. Ultimately, all of these stories are made up anyways. What's canon doesn't need to necessarily influence your enjoyment of the work. You can look at Star Wars Legends as sort of an alternate history or a different self-contained story set in the same universe with plenty to enjoy and with a beginning, a middle, and a defined end. Of course, things are also recanonized all the time, from certain TIE models like the TIE Defender to major characters like Grand Admiral Thrawn to entire storylines. So I'm just saying, don't discount something because it doesn't have the official canon checkmark to it. There's a lot to enjoy in the Star Wars Legends expanded universe. But let's get back to the central question. Where do I start with the old Star Wars expanded universe? First of all, the great thing about the old EU is that it was forwarded through so many different mediums. If you don't necessarily like reading comic books or novels, then you can play the video games, and there were so many good Legends video games. If you like the Old Republic era, you should start with Knights of the Old Republic 1, which still holds up fairly well and can even be played on your cell phone. If you're more interested in the Galactic Civil War era like I am, there's a ton of variety. If you like third-person adventure games, go play the Jedi Knight franchise. If you like real-time strategy games, go play Empire at War. If you want to be a starfighter, you can play the Rogue Squadron games. There's so many options. A lot of these also tie in very heavily with the novels. For example, in the original Rogue Squadron game for the N64, one of the missions takes place at the same time as the Dark Empire Crisis, which was first introduced in comics, then later adapted into novels. Shadows of the Empire and The Force Unleashed were both also multimedia projects, so they offer a good way to get into the books. Just find an area and a time that you're interested in, and then go from there. But I'm not going to talk anymore about video games. There's a ton of videos already discussing that topic. I want to look more at books. Where should you start reading if you want to get into the Star Wars Legends expanded universe? So I always recommend that new EU readers start with the Thrawn Trilogy. The Thrawn Trilogy was really the first piece of content in the post-Endor Star Wars expanded universe. The trilogy starts with Heir to the Empire, which introduces not only Thrawn, but a ton of other characters who would play very important parts in the expanded universe. Talking characters like Mara Jade, Talon Karrde, Admiral Pellaeon, of course Thrawn himself, and countless others. Not only is this story one of the most important in Star Wars history because it really kickstarted a revitalization of the Star Wars expanded universe and helped drum up interest eventually for new movies, but it's also really, really good. Some might wonder, well, wouldn't it be better to actually start chronologically, so back in the time of the Old Republic? That is one option. I don't think that is the best way to go. I'll cover that later. I highly recommend starting with the Thrawn Trilogy. And the good thing is, after this trilogy, you probably will know whether you like this era of Star Wars or not. If you don't like the post-Return of the Jedi books, thankfully there's lots of other areas to look in. I really do, so we're going to talk first about other key entries in this era. It's also worth noting that all of these books are also available on Audible, or at least most of them. I highly, highly recommend the Thrawn Trilogy on Audible. They're in their full version. They have excellent narration, along with sound effects and full John Williams music. Some of the other books are abridged versions, which means they're slightly shortened. Usually you can listen to an abridged version in 4 or 5 hours, while a full version is about 16 or 17 depending on the length of the book, sometimes less, closer to 12. The point is, if you're not sure how interested you are in a particular story, but you'd still like to get most of the high points, then the abridged versions are a great idea. I do recommend not listening to the abridged versions for the X-Wing series. I think that the abridgment is pretty rough, and it can be fairly hard to follow, especially if you've never read it before. Anyway, so you've read the Thrawn Trilogy, where should you go next? I recommend the Truce at Baccarat. It is a bit rough of a book. It's one of the first Star Wars Legends books, but it occurs literally one day after the Battle of Endor, and I think it does a good job of setting up the universe. I don't find the next chronological book, The Shadows of Mindor, to be super consequential, so in my opinion you can move right on to the X-Wing series. The X-Wing series is really among the fan favorites of the early Star Wars EU. Most of the series, at least chronologically at this point, focuses on the New Republic's fight against various Imperial warlords, including Zinj and Asani Isard. I recommend that you read at least the first 4, which are called the Rogue Squadron series. These deal with the formation of Rogue Squadron, the New Republic's attempt to capture Coruscant, and really, you just get a good insight into the universe at the time, and the stories are fairly fun too. You can read the other ones, but if you don't like the X-Wing series, you can fairly move on to the Courtship of Princess Leia. Tone-wise, this book is fairly similar to the Truce at Baccarat. The only really important thing for the universe moving forward is that we learn a bit more about Luke's force powers, and it ties up the Warlord Zinj arc. This is also the last story before the twins and the Solo children generally are introduced. Chronologically after this, the Thrawn Trilogy would come in, but as we've already read that, a good place to stop now is the Dark Empire series. This deals with the resurrection of Emperor Palpatine, Luke Skywalker falling to the dark side, and the birth of Anakin Solo. You technically could skip this, I guess, if you don't like comic books. I think earlier I mistakenly said that it's in novel form. What I meant is that you can get it in an audiobook, but it's got interesting art, and I think it's a kind of fun little romp through the Star Wars universe, although it is weird. Next we have the Jedi Academy Trilogy. Some people are a little bit harsh on this series. I think it's still pretty good. I recommend listening to the actual trilogy itself on audiobook because I think it really covers most of the main high points. There's also iJedi, which isn't really a retcon of the Jedi Academy Trilogy, but it inserts Corran Horn into it. It's only one book, and I think reading it right after the trilogy works quite well. Corran becomes even more important early on, and he also stars in the X-Wing series that we discussed earlier, so I think that it's an important read. If you like video games, now would be a good time to stop over and play the Jedi Academy series because it's set at just about this time and features another fan favorite, Jedi in training Kyle Katarn. At this point, you've basically been fully introduced into the Star Wars expanded universe. You know how everything works, all the major players are in effect. Then there are several arcs. If you're still interested, the easiest way to tackle these is just to read them in order. You have the Black Fleet Crisis, the Corellian Trilogy, which I quite like, the Hand of Thrawn duology, which reintroduces Thrawn, sort of, I don't want to spoil it, and then later, the Yuuzhan Vong invasion. There's also the book Survivor Quest, which I recommend you read before getting to the Outbound Flight. It sets up the mystery in a really interesting way. Although the Outbound Flight technically does take place during the prequels, I still recommend you wait. So if you want a break from reading, if you want to come back to it later, I recommend that you take some time and read some one-off Star Wars stories. There are several options here. You can go back to the old Star Wars Marvel comics, which I really like. They're really self-contained stories. They don't have a lot of impact on the plot, but they are fun and they are referenced sometimes. Between the Star Wars Marvel and the Marvel UK comic book series, there's literally hundreds and hundreds of comics for you to read. I recommend that you check out Star Wars Wikipedia, read some topics, and find some that interest you. A lot of these will be connected to comics, especially some of the weirder ones. Just keep in mind that besides for some world-building aspects, the plot of these stories won't really impact the expanded universe in a great deal. They're more for fun. If you want something that's a bit more impactful, I highly recommend that you check out the short story collections. For example, the Tales of the Bounty Hunters or Tales of the Mos Eisley Cantina. Those are really fun and they add really interesting backstories to some of the characters that we actually see in the main movies. One sort of interesting thing though is Star Wars does like to bring back characters from relatively obscure sources, especially when they need a new character, whether it's a villain or a protagonist. The best example of this that I can think of is Lumia, who first appeared in the Star Wars Marvel UK comic book series. She would play a fairly substantial role in the later Star Wars Legends stories. If you're more interested in the nuances of this sort of stuff, by the way, besides for watching my channel, I also recommend the Essential Reader's Companion, which was written by Pablo Hidalgo and gives insight into basically all of the novels of the Star Wars universe. So now that we've covered the post-Endor bit of Star Wars Legends, I'll give some recommendations for other eras. First of all, if you want to learn about the origins of the Jedi and the Force, check out the Dawn of the Jedi comic book series. I believe that it's the earliest work within the Star Wars expanded universe. There's also the Darth Bane trilogy for those who want to learn about the Sith, Bane, and the Rule of Two, but my personal favorite pre-Endor book within Star Wars Legends is easily Plagueis. It tells the story about Darth Plagueis, his master Darth Tenebris, and Palpatine's rise for power. It also manages to connect dozens, if not more, expanded universe stories, sometimes in little ways, sometimes in big ways. There's also the Outbound Flight, which I think is one of the more unique Star Wars stories, although I do recommend reading some of the previously mentioned things before getting here. Finally, I'd also like to give a brief shout out to some of the other stories I like, including Shatterpoint, Death Star, and of course the original Han Solo and Lando Calrissian trilogies, which are basically the epitome of Star Wars cheese. Anyways guys, this is my basic introduction to the Star Wars Legends expanded universe. I hope for some of you that are thinking about getting right into the series that this is the push that you need to actually start reading. Trust me, it's really worth it, and although these stories are no longer canon, they continue to influence the Star Wars universe as a whole and remain very, very enjoyable. Anyway, thanks for watching guys. If you have any questions about Star Wars Legends, put them down in the comments and or I'm sure someone else will try to give you a hand. Till next time, this has been EckhartsLadder. May the Force be with you.